Nathan always believed that love, when built on trust and time, could withstand anything. He had spent more than a decade with Samantha, convinced that their bond was unbreakable. They had weathered life's storms together, celebrated victories, shared laughter, and faced hardships as a team. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but in his mind, it was solid, something worth fighting for. He never doubted her, never questioned where she was when she worked late, never guessed the moments she seemed distant. He trusted her because she was his wife. That trust was about to be shattered in a way he never saw coming. The night started like any other formal event they attended together. Another charity gala. Another evening filled with small talk and elegant dresses. The kind of thing Samantha thrived in. Nathan wasn't fond of these events, but he went for her. He liked seeing her happy. Liked watching the way she lit up in social settings. Tonight she was stunning, her red dress clinging to her in a way that made every head turn. He felt proud, knowing she was his. Knowing she had chosen him all those years ago. He had no idea that by the end of the night, everything he believed about their marriage would come crashing down. He was standing by the bar, mid-conversation with a colleague, when something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a glance, a fleeting connection between Samantha and a stranger across the room. But Nathan saw it. The way her lips curled into a smile, that wasn't polite or forced. It was real. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, a small nervous habit she had whenever she was excited. His chest tightened. He wanted to believe it was nothing, a casual moment between two people in a crowded room. But then the man moved closer. Nathan's breath caught when the music changed to a slow song. The stranger extended his hand, and without hesitation, Samantha took it. She stepped into his space, her body molding to his as they moved in sync. Effortless. As if they had done this before. Nathan waited for her to glance his way, to acknowledge him, to give him some reassurance that this was innocent. But she never looked at him. She was lost in that moment, with that man. Swaying under the glow of the chandeliers like Nathan wasn't even there. A dull roar filled his ears, drowning out everything but the image before him. The conversation around him blurred. His pulse pounded. He should have walked over, should have pulled her away, should have demanded an explanation. But deep down, he already knew the truth. This wasn't just a dance. This wasn't just one moment. This was something that had been building long before tonight. And he had been too blind to see it. Without another thought, he turned on his heel and walked out of the ballroom. Out of the life he thought was his. He didn't make a scene, didn't give her the satisfaction of an argument, didn't even look back. He just disappeared. And the moment he was gone, Samantha's mistake became clear to her. But by then, it was too late. The night was supposed to be ordinary, just another gala. Another event filled with clinking glasses and polite smiles. Nathan never enjoyed these things, but Samantha did, and for her, he endured them. He watched as she moved through the room. Effortlessly charming everyone, her red dress hugging her in a way that made her the center of attention. He had always admired that about her. The way she could light up a space just by being in it. He never imagined that tonight, that light would expose something he was never meant to see. It started with a glance, a fleeting moment that should have meant nothing. But Nathan saw it. The way her eyes locked onto the stranger across the room, the way her lips curved into a smile that wasn't just polite. It was warm, familiar. His stomach twisted, but he forced himself to look away. She was just being friendly. That's who she was, that's what he told himself. But then the man approached. Nathan stiffened as he watched the stranger lean in, whisper something in Samantha's ear. She laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh she hadn't given him in years. Then, before Nathan could process what was happening, the man extended his hand, and without hesitation, Samantha took it. The music shifted, slow and deliberate, and she let herself be pulled onto the dance floor. Nathan's chest tightened. He expected her to glance back, to acknowledge him, to give him some reassurance that this was nothing more than a casual moment. But she didn't. She was already lost in it, swaying in the stranger's arms. Her body pressing against his in a way that made Nathan's blood turn to ice. It wasn't just a dance. It was the way her hand rested on the man's shoulder. The way his fingers skimmed the small of her back. It was the way she leaned in just slightly, like she belonged there. Like she had done this before. His grip tightened around the glass in his hand. He could storm over, pull her away, demand an answer. He could make a scene. But something in him stopped. Because in that moment, watching her move in perfect sync with another man. This wasn't the first time. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some passing moment of poor judgment. It had been happening long before tonight. The realization hit harder than any punch could. His hands were shaking, his vision tunneling, but he forced himself to stay composed. He wasn't going to be the fool who begged for an explanation. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had broken him. So instead, he set his glass down, turned away, and walked out of the room without a word. Samantha never even noticed. Not until he was gone, and by then, it was far too late. The cold night air hit Nathan like a slap as he stepped outside, but he barely felt it. His mind was spinning. His heart beat thudding in his ears like a war drum. He had walked out without a scene, without a single word, but inside, everything was unraveling. The image of Samantha in that man's arms was burned into his brain, playing on an endless loop. The way she smiled, the way she leaned in just slightly, the way she forgot he even existed. His hands trembled as he yanked his tie loose. He needed air, needed space, needed something to ground him before the rage and humiliation swallowed him whole. His car was parked just across the street, but his legs felt heavy, as if some invisible force was keeping him rooted in place. He wanted to turn back, to demand answers, to make her look him in the eye and admit what she had done. But deep down, he already knew the truth. And he wasn't sure he could survive hearing it from her lips. A part of him kept waiting, hoping, praying, that the doors would burst open. That she would come running after him, breathless and desperate, begging him to understand. That she would tell him it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, that she was sorry. But the doors stayed closed. The ballroom lights kept glowing, the music kept playing, and inside, Samantha was still dancing. Still pretending he didn't exist. Nathan clenched his jaw, his nails digging into his palms. Every second that passed was another knife in his chest. Another confirmation that he was the only one fighting for a marriage that had already fallen apart. He had spent years believing in them. In her. And now, in the span of a single evening, she had torn it all down. He forced himself forward, crossing the street in quick, determined strides. His fingers fumbled for his keys as he reached his car. But his hands were shaking too much to grip them properly. He sucked in a sharp breath, trying to steady himself, but it was useless. His world had just been ripped out from under him. And there was nothing left to hold on to. He finally managed to unlock the door and slid into the driver's seat. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could still turn back. He could still go inside, still demand an explanation, still fight for something that had already been lost. But no, he had fought long enough. Without another thought, he started the car. The engine roaring to life, drowning out the chaos in his head. He pulled away from the curb, watching the glowing lights of the gala disappear in his rearview mirror. Samantha never came after him. She never even noticed he was gone. Nathan's hands were still shaking as he drove, his mind racing faster than the car speeding down the empty streets. The city lights blurred past him, streaks of gold and red flashing across his windshield. But all he could see was her. Samantha, pressed against another man, her fingers grazing his shoulder. Her lips curling into a smile that wasn't meant for Nathan. The way she never looked back. The way she never noticed he had left. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles bone white. He should have been furious. He should have been slamming his fist against the dashboard. Cursing her name, screaming into the silence. But all he felt was a cold, hollow emptiness curling around his ribs. Suffocating him from the inside out. A buzzing sound snapped him back to reality. His phone. His pulse spiked as he reached for it, his breath hitching in his throat. Maybe it was her. Maybe she had finally realized. Maybe she was calling to explain, to beg him to come back, to tell him it was all a mistake. But when he glanced at the screen, the hope that had barely begun to rise in his chest crumbled into dust. No missed calls. No messages. Nothing. Samantha wasn't looking for him. She wasn't chasing after him. She wasn't even thinking about him. His stomach twisted as the realization settled deep in his bones. This wasn't just about tonight. This wasn't just about one dance, one betrayal. This had been happening for a long time, and he had been too blind to see it. The car skidded to a stop in an empty parking lot. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. He let his head fall back against the seat, staring at the ceiling, willing the chaos in his mind to quiet. But it didn't. Because the truth was staring him in the face, clearer than ever before. Samantha hadn't just forgotten about him tonight. She had let go of him a long time ago. And somehow, he had been the last one to notice. Nathan sat motionless behind the wheel. The engine still humming beneath him, but his thoughts were louder than the sound of the car. He kept staring at his phone, hoping, stupidly hoping, for some sign that Samantha cared. A single message. A missed call. Anything to prove she had noticed his absence. But the screen remained dark, empty. That silence screamed louder than any words ever could. His fingers hovered over the contact list. Indecision tightening in his chest. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want advice. But he needed the truth. Something real to ground him before he lost himself in the mess unraveling inside his head. And there was only one person who might have answers. Chris. His closest friend. The one person who'd always seen through people better than Nathan ever could. Without thinking, he typed a message. I need to talk. Be honest with me. He hit send before he could second guess it. The reply came fast. Where are you? Minutes later, Nathan found himself parked outside a dimly lit bar. A place far from their usual hangouts. He wasn't there for a drink. He needed truth, clarity, something to cut through the fog of betrayal clouding his mind. Chris arrived within 10 minutes. His expression was tense the moment he walked in, eyes scanning the room before landing on Nathan. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid into the seat across from him and asked quietly. You saw it, didn't you? Nathan's jaw clenched. I saw enough. Chris let out a breath, rubbing his hands together. I didn't want to be the one to tell you. But yeah, it's not the first time. The words slammed into Nathan like a punch to the chest. He stared at his friend, barely able to speak. How long? Chris hesitated, guilt flickering in his eyes. A few months. Maybe longer. I don't have proof. Just pieces. Conversations, glances, whispers when she thought no one was listening. I should have told you. The bar around them faded. All Nathan could hear was the sound of his own breath, shallow and uneven. So it hadn't started tonight. The dance wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment it could no longer be hidden. Who is he? Nathan asked, voice low, cold. Chris looked away. Someone from her charity board. They've been close. Too close. Nathan's fists clenched under the table. Every word from Chris felt like another blow. Every answer carved deeper into the truth he hadn't been ready to face. Samantha hadn't just strayed. She had made choices. Quiet, deliberate, and calculated. And all this time, while he had been holding their marriage together, she had already started letting it fall apart. His heart pounded as the final pieces clicked into place. He wasn't just betrayed. He had been replaced. Nathan left the bar with his pulse pounding like a war drum in his chest. The cold night air did nothing to cool the heat rising beneath his skin. Every word Chris had said replayed in his mind, clearer and sharper with each passing second. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This wasn't a moment of weakness. Samantha had been slipping away for months. Maybe longer. And Nathan had been too blind, too trusting, too desperate to believe their marriage was still intact. He drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly ahead, headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. His thoughts spiraled, twisting tighter and tighter around one burning question. Why hadn't he seen it? The late night meetings, the sudden detachment, the way her eyes stopped lighting up when she looked at him. It had all been there. Every sign. Every warning. But he hadn't wanted to believe it. He had chosen denial over confrontation. Comfort over clarity. As he pulled into the driveway, the house stared back at him. Still, quiet, familiar. But now, it felt foreign. The place he had once called home now felt like a stage set for a performance he hadn't realized he was no longer part of. He sat in the car, watching the living room window glowing softly behind the curtains. Samantha was inside. Waiting. Relaxed. Unaware, or worse, unconcerned. About the emotional wreckage she had left behind at that gala. He stepped out of the car, fists clenched, spine rigid. He didn't storm in, didn't shout or slam the door. He entered like a ghost, his silence louder than any rage. There she was. Curled on the couch, with a glass of wine, scrolling her phone, her red dress still clinging to her like a cruel reminder of the night. He'd watched her betray him in real time. She looked up, startled. Nathan, you're back. He stared at her, expression unreadable. Yeah, I am. She sat up straighter, her smile fading under his glare. You left so suddenly. What's going on? His voice was steady, controlled, but sharp enough to cut. You were dancing with another man, Samantha. You didn't even notice I walked out. Her eyes flickered. A crack in her facade. It was just a dance. Then why did it feel like a goodbye? She said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Nathan felt it snapping inside him, piece by piece. The denial, the excuses, the lies. He'd had enough. I talked to Chris, he said, low and cold. I know this wasn't the first time. She froze. Her glass trembled in her hand. That was all the confirmation he needed. And in that moment, Nathan understood. The woman in front of him wasn't the same person he'd built a life with. She had already left him a long time ago. He was just finally catching up. Nathan stood in the middle of the living room. The weight of everything pressing down on his chest like a crushing force. Samantha sat across from him, eyes wide, fingers tightening around her wine glass. But her expression wasn't guilt. It was panic. Not because she regretted what she'd done, but because she'd finally lost control of the narrative. He took a step closer, his voice low and sharp. Who is he? She blinked. What? You heard me. The man you were dancing with. The one who had his hands on you like I didn't even exist. Who is he? There was a moment. A flicker of hesitation, a twitch of her jaw, a shift in her posture. That was all it took. She didn't even need to answer. Nathan already knew. Just someone from the charity board. She said, trying to sound casual, but her voice cracked around the edges. Just someone. He repeated, nodding slowly. Right. The room went still. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed deafening. Nathan's hands were shaking again, but he wasn't sure if it was from rage or heartbreak, or... I talked to Chris, he said. He told me this isn't the first time. Her body tensed. Chris doesn't know what he's talking about. Doesn't he? Samantha looked away, jaw clenched. The silence between them was suffocating. She finally stood, setting her glass down. Nathan, this is getting out of hand. You're reading too much into one moment. You're letting your emotions cloud. Do you love him? His words hit the room like a gunshot. She froze. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted toward the floor. He waited. Heart pounding in his ears. I don't know, she whispered. Those 3 words were all it took. The final thread snapped. Nathan stepped back, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. You don't know. She looked at him then, eyes glassy, mouth trembling like she wanted to say more. But he didn't want to hear it. I gave you 10 years, Samantha. 10 years of loyalty, of trust, of believing in us. And all you have to say is, I don't know. She reached for him, but he pulled away. The touch that used to comfort him now felt foreign, hollow. He turned and walked toward the hallway, his footsteps heavy, final. Her voice followed him, desperate now. Please, Nathan, don't walk away. We can fix this. Just let's talk. He stopped. Turned halfway toward her. His eyes met hers, but there was no softness left in his gaze. I think you already made your choice, he said quietly. And then he walked away, leaving her standing there. In the ruins of everything they had built. Nathan moved through the hallway with a strange, eerie calm, but inside, everything was on fire. The moment Samantha said, I don't know. Something in him snapped. The foundation of their marriage hadn't just cracked. It collapsed. He reached the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out a suitcase with steady hands that betrayed the storm inside him. Every movement was mechanical. Grabbing clothes, folding them, zipping them away. As if packing up 10 years of a life could be done in a matter of minutes. Behind him, he heard her footsteps. Hesitant. Like she was suddenly afraid of stepping too close. Afraid of what she might see in his eyes now, that he wasn't the man who stood by her side, blindly trusting her. Nathan. She called softly from the doorway. What are you doing? He didn't answer. He folded one more shirt, pressed it into the suitcase, zipped it shut, and only then turned to face her. Her face was pale, eyes wide. A trace of regret flickering. But not the kind that comes from hurting someone. It was the regret of someone who didn't expect to get caught. Now you want to talk, he said quietly. Where was this energy when I walked out of that ballroom? She stepped closer, arms wrapped tightly across her chest. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what you wanted from me. I wanted honesty, he snapped. I wanted my wife to look at me and tell me the truth. But you couldn't even do that. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. It didn't mean anything, Nathan. He laughed, cold, hollow. You keep saying that like it's supposed to make it better. She reached for him, fingers brushing his arm. Desperate now. Please don't do this. Don't throw everything away. He pulled his arm back, eyes burning. I'm not the one who threw it away. You did. You just didn't think I'd walk. She stood frozen, helpless. I gave you everything, he said, voice low and heavy. Time, trust, love, and all I got back was a dance with a stranger, and an I don't know, when I asked if you loved someone else. She had no reply. Nathan picked up his suitcase, and brushed past her, heart pounding, breath tight in his chest. As he reached the door, her voice came one last time. Weak, desperate. Please, stay. Let's figure this out. He turned slightly. Not enough to see her face, just enough to say what needed to be said. I think you already figured it out, Samantha. You just didn't expect me to. And with that, he stepped into the cold night, leaving behind not just a house, but a life that no longer belonged to him. Nathan stood on the porch, suitcase in hand, the night air wrapping around him like ice. He didn't move right away. He couldn't. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of traffic in the distance, and the soft hum of streetlights overhead. Behind him, the house he once called home stood quiet, glowing faintly from the inside. He wondered if Samantha was still standing there, watching him leave, wondering if he'd turn around. But he didn't. He walked to his car with heavy steps, every footfall echoing like a final goodbye. He opened the door and slid into the seat, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His heart was pounding. But not from uncertainty. This time it was clarity. He knew he couldn't stay, couldn't pretend, couldn't keep loving someone who had already chosen someone else long before tonight. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to look. He knew it was her. He let it ring until it stopped. Another buzz. Message this time. Still, he didn't check. He didn't want apologies. Didn't want more empty words. Nothing she said could erase what he saw, what he felt, or how easily she had let everything slip through her fingers. He started the engine. Headlights cutting through the darkness, tires crunching softly on the gravel as he pulled away. But he didn't know where he was going. Not home, not to a hotel, just away. As far as the road would take him. Anywhere that wasn't soaked in the memory of her hands on another man. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Then another, his jaw clenched. Finally, he glanced at the screen. Samantha's name lit up in bold letters followed by her words. Please talk to me. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. He laughed bitterly under his breath. This way. What did she expect? That he'd come home and pretend none of it happened. That he'd sit across from her at dinner, and swallow his pain with every forced smile. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, where it buzzed again like a relentless ghost of a life he no longer wanted. The city blurred past his window, neon signs flickering, casting strange shadows across the dashboard. He drove without music, without direction, letting the silence fill the space where her voice used to be. For the first time in years, he wasn't heading home. He wasn't heading anywhere familiar. And somehow, that felt more right than anything he'd known in months. Because the truth was clear now. Samantha hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She'd abandoned it. Nathan was just finally choosing to stop pretending he hadn't noticed. Nathan drove for hours, the road a blur beneath his tires. Headlights illuminating nothing, but the endless stretch of asphalt ahead. He didn't have a destination. Just a desperate need to keep moving, to outrun the weight pressing against his chest. Every mile felt like a small escape from the life he had just left behind, but no matter how far he went, Samantha's betrayal clung to him like smoke. His phone vibrated again. He ignored it. It had buzzed non-stop since he left the house, her name flashing over and over like some cruel joke. He finally grabbed it and checked the screen. 5 missed calls, 8 messages. Nathan. Please come home. We need to talk. You're blowing this out of proportion. The last one made his blood boil. Blowing it out of proportion. She had emotionally abandoned him. Danced with another man like he was invisible, and now she wanted to downplay it. Like it was just a misunderstanding, instead of the final fracture in a marriage, already eroding from within. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat and clenched the wheel tighter. He didn't want to go back. Not to her. Not to that house full of broken promises. But he also didn't want to stay lost. He needed something, anything, to feel real again. His mind flashed to Chris. Maybe he was still awake. Maybe he'd understand what Nathan couldn't even say out loud yet. He turned off the highway and headed toward the outskirts of town, where a quiet diner stood like a beacon in the night. The parking lot was nearly empty, the neon sign flickering above the door. He pulled in and sat for a moment, engine still running, staring at his own reflection in the window. He looked tired, worn down, like a man who'd finally realized the woman he loved had stopped loving him long ago. Inside, the diner was dimly lit and nearly silent. He slid into a booth and nodded to the waitress when she approached. "Just coffee," he muttered. Moments later, Chris walked through the door. He didn't speak at first. Just sat across from Nathan and studied him. "You okay?" Nathan exhaled a shaky breath. "No. But I think I'm finally done pretending I am." Chris nodded slowly. "So what now?" Nathan stared into his coffee, watching the steam curl into the air. "Now, I figure out how to start over." Outside, the sun was starting to rise. Streaks of pale gold breaking through the horizon. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt something close to peace. He didn't have all the answers. But at least now, he wasn't living a lie. Nathan's story is a brutal reminder that betrayal doesn't always come with slammed doors or shouted arguments. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in glances, in the absence of effort. He had spent years nurturing a marriage he believed was strong, only to discover he had been fighting alone. The heartbreak didn't begin with Samantha's dance. It began with all the quiet moments she stopped choosing him. The days she pulled away while he held on tighter. In the end, Nathan didn't just walk away from a failing marriage. He walked toward truth, toward healing, toward reclaiming the part of himself he had slowly given up. His journey was not about revenge or rage. It was about dignity, self-worth, and the courage to stop settling for half love. The lesson here is simple but powerful: love must be mutual. A relationship built on loyalty, respect, and connection cannot survive when only one person is still holding the pieces together. Don't ignore the quiet red flags. Don't silence your intuition to keep the peace. And most importantly, don't be afraid to choose yourself when someone else stops choosing you. Healing starts the moment you stop begging to be seen and start demanding to be valued.